Welcome back. Final session of the event coming up, and the most fun. That's a big, that's a big claim. But I'm glad you're all here. I hope you ate well. I had some nice food, which was good. And thank you for being here. Now, we're going to have a session on the art of communication in the travel industry with three. I'm being one of them, and there'll be three other amazing people who can hopefully tell you about the pitfalls and the ways to do it and the ways not to do it, which I think is so important, because communication, whether it's about sustainability or not in the travel industry, is still something that can be improved, from my personal experience anyway. And I'm just looking at a PR person here to my right-hand side. And I'm just realising that, I'm sure you know just as much as I do, Tess. Anyway, before we go on, before we get to that, I'm going to have a really good presentation. Apparently there's been some tech issues with the title, but I'm now going to help correct that by basically saying to you that Jess, who's going to come on in a second, and I'll introduce her properly, she'll be talking about unlocking more sustainable flight choices with a case study on a pilot project that Sabre and Google have worked on to reduce the emissions of business travel. So a really important topic. And to talk about that, can I please bring on, you may recognise her from the media, Jessica Matthias, Sustainability Director, Sabre Corporation.
Thanks, Rajan. Thanks, everyone. Just go over here from the clicker. Okay, as Rajan said, I'm going to talk today about how accurate measurement and accurate data can lead to more sustainable flight decisions. And I'm going to use a case study that Sabre and Google have carried out in this area to help address this issue. So can I have the slides? Okay. 1 minute, okay? As long as I can have the time back. It's ticking away. Okay, great, here we are. All right, so let's get started. So I'm going to start with a story. 10 years ago, I don't know if you remember, around 2014, when you went to the supermarket, you would you buy your shopping, and then you'd be given a series of disposable plastic bags to put the shopping in. It was a big waste of plastic. But then 10 years ago, in the UK, the government introduced a 5p charge for shopping bags. So every time you took one, you'd have to pay 5p. It seemed like a small charge at the time, but what it did is it instigated a wealth of change. What happened was remarkable. People stopped using these disposable shopping bags, and they brought their own bags shopping instead. After the UK, other countries also brought in similar schemes. Spain introduced something like that in 2018, and now 25 European countries have similar schemes charging for disposable plastic bags. The effect in the UK has been enormous. Now the average person in the UK takes just 2 shopping bags from stores throughout the year, as opposed to 140 back in 2014. So it's a big change, a big shift in consumer behaviour. And actually that saved, if this will work, that saved around 19 billion plastic bags from being made. It's 60,000 tons of plastic that's been saved. And just to put that into perspective, this clicker's a bit slow. That's the equivalent of the weight of 6 Eiffel Towers. So it's pretty significant. So you might be wondering now, that's all great and everything, but why am I talking about plastic bags at a travel conference? What's shopping got to do with travel? Well, the reason I mention it is because it's a great example of the ripple effect. So a series of small actions happening that lead to big shifts in consumer behaviour. There was a long campaign of education that happened between supermarkets, governments, schools, and consumers themselves. Pretty similar to the challenge that we have in travel. But for airlines, arguably, the challenge is a lot bigger. Traveling, people have a bigger connection to it than they do plastic bags. It's far more essential for some people to travel than it is for them to use 5p carrier bags. So what do we do? Whose responsibility is it to start making the same shifts in the choices we make when we're flying? Is it governments? Is it airlines? Is it technology companies like Sabre? Or is it the traveller themselves? The answer is really, it's all of us. We all have a responsibility to start making more sustainable decisions about how we fly right now. There are lots of moves going on in the background on long-term solutions to the decarbonisation of aviation. It's a big challenge to reach net zero by 2050. But while those big things happen, there are things that we can be doing now to make sure that we choose the most sustainable options when we do have to fly. But we can't change what we don't measure, right? We can't be expected to choose more sustainable flights if we don't understand what our flight footprint actually is. So the problem is the ways of measuring carbon emissions from flights at the moment is a little bit like a bull in a china shop. They're a little bit clumsy. They're basically, most methods of measuring flight emissions at the moment are based on distance alone, so the distance between the destination and the origin, whereas in reality there are a lot more factors that contribute to the emissions generated by a particular flight. So wouldn't it be great if, imagine what would be possible if we had a more accurate understanding of our footprint from flights and more granular sustainability data that could inform our flight decisions, and of course the technology that can help put that information in front of us at the time when we're booking flights. So what Sabre and Google did is we came together to try to address this problem. Sabre did a little experiment. It used its travel impact model, which is its way of measuring flight emissions, and it applied that model to every single flight taken by Sabre's employees in 2023 to come up with what our total flight footprint would be. The travel impact model's criteria takes into account a lot more than just distance when it's measuring flight emissions. There are all sorts of other factors as well, such as aircraft type, how new the aircraft is, what the seating configuration is like on board, whether it's using any proportion of sustainable fuels versus traditional fuels, and even what cargo weight it carries, so how much luggage it can take with it. The travel impact models, as many people already know, it's already available as a way of measuring estimations for future flights. So when you search for a flight, you'll likely see a carbon calculation next to each flight. And that was likely done using the travel impact model. But why this study between Sabre and Google was significant was that it was the first time that the model has ever been used to measure estimated emissions for actual flights taken by a company. So when applying this model for the first time, Google revealed that Sabre could quite easily, without just stopping flying, because that's the obvious way to reduce emissions from flying, right? It's just to stop flying. But without making that much significant changes to how often we travel, Google found that we could save 10% on the emissions generated by the flights we take just by picking slightly different flights at different times of day. So Google found that Sabre, 1 in 5 of the flights that our team members take is long haul, but those long haul routes are responsible for about 77% of our total emissions, so a big chunk. So they think that we should focus on optimizing the carbon efficiency in those routes, and that's typically between London, where we have our EMEA headquarters, and Dallas, where we are globally headquartered. So that's a common route for us. So having this data and knowledge available of how we can make those savings of 10% at least will be really invaluable for us as we're starting to go down the science-based targets route next year. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit more detail about the 2 recommendations that Google's given us of how we can reduce our flight emissions. I don't know if anybody remembers the retro card game Top Trumps. Well, I've just tried to illustrate it in a kind of fun way here by laying out different flights, 2 fictional flights here as Top Trump cards. Using the traditional model of calculating estimated emissions, you can see that's what I've called the other model there. You can see that these 2 fictional flights, which are based on real data, the other model is showing up that they both emit the same amount of carbon per seat per passenger. So that's the figure there, 2,703 kilograms of CO2 per passenger using the traditional model of calculation. Whereas you can see the travel impact model, the figures are quite wildly different, because in reality these flights are wildly different. The route between Dallas and London is where the similarity ends. But the TIM takes into account when the airline was made, the aircraft, sorry. The one on the on the left, Flight 1 is a newer aircraft. It was made in 2022. It's 25% more fuel efficient than the other aircraft, which is older. And it's got a sort of more economical seating arrangement. It's got more economy class seats, and it carries more load. So you can see that the flight on the left, Flight 1, if we were able to steer our employees when they're booking travel towards that flight, then that would be the more sustainable or the lower emitting option to go for. And then second, and those are flights that were on the same day as well, so it wouldn't be that much of a difference for our team members. And then the second recommendation that Google gave from the study is to choose the direct route over the indirect. More often than not, the direct route is the more sustainable. But again, using the traditional distance-based model of calculating emissions, it's coming up as the same. So this is another fictional flight, this time between Dallas and Sydney. So obviously Dallas and Sydney are the same distance apart in both cases, but Flight 1 is a direct flight, a very long route, and direct 2 stops over in San Francisco. This direct versus indirect has quite a big difference on emissions. You can see the travel impact model when taking that into account, along with some of the other factors there, seating capacity, percentage of sustainable fuels being used, and things like load factor, that again, Flight 1 is a more sustainable or lower emitting option. So what next? What does this mean? Well, now that we have this data, which we didn't have before, we can easily now incorporate these changes into our travel policy when we look at that next year. And we can also use our technology to steer people the same way we do on price towards that lower emitting, more sustainable flight choice. But more excitingly, and this is not just a Sabre story, for the industry now that this model it's not quite available just yet, but Google is now planning to make this model publicly available to any company in the world free of charge as a way of measuring their past actual emissions for Scope 3 reporting. So for Sabre, that means we'll also be looking at how we can integrate that reporting option into our tools for travel agencies and corporations so that everybody can do what we've just done. And that is an example of the ripple effect I was speaking about earlier. Thank you.